House of the Dragon will start a build-up towards the Dance of the Dragons, and the early seasons will cover the dance itself. Later seasons, however, will be based on George R. R. Martin's yet unfinished Fire and Blood Volume 2 book, that will continue with Queen Rhaenyra's son King Aegon III's reign, and will include Blackfyre Rebellion and go all the way to the end of the Targaryen dynasty, to Robert's Rebellion, including the rebellion itself. If you'd like to know a bit more of what the show will be about, well, I cannot actually spill those beans. Martin teased in his blog. But you might want to pick up a copy of two anthologies I did with Gardner Dozois, Dangerous Women and Rogues, and then move on to Archmaester Gildain's history Fire and Blood. Dangerous Women includes what press materials describe as a 35,000-word novella by Martin called The Princess and the Queen, or The Blacks and the Greens, which is about the Dance of the Dragons, the vast civil war that tore Westeros apart, nearly 2 centuries before the events of Game of Thrones. The Greens were the faction during the Dance of the Dragons that supported the claim of Aegon II Targaryen, their rivals being the Blacks, who supported the claim of Rhaenyra Targaryen. Both were named for the color of their clothes worn during one tourney. Rogues meanwhile includes Martin's story The Rogue Prince, or A King's Brother, which chronicles their early life, adventures, misdeeds, and marriages of Prince Daemon Targaryen, considered one of the biggest rogues in the entire history of Ice and Fire. Finally, the novel Fire and Blood, released in November 2018, is the first novel of a 2-part history of the Targaryens in Westeros. Centuries before the events of A Game of Thrones, House Targaryen, the only family of Dragonlords to survive the doom of Valyria, took up residence on Dragonstone, according to the book's description on the author's site. Fire and Blood begins their tale with the legendary Aegon the Conqueror, creator of the Iron Throne, and goes on to recount the generations of Targaryens who fought to hold that iconic seat, all the way up to the civil war that nearly tore their dynasty apart. In addition to this, few casting calls have been known. I'm speaking of that of Daemon Targaryen, the Rogue Prince, confirming that the House of the Dragon will be about the Dance of the Dragons, the Targaryen Civil War. Miguel Sapochnik and Ryan Condal will serve as showrunners and executive producers. George R. R. Martin will also serve as executive producer. I get many questions from fans asking if they need to even watch the show when they've just finished Fire and Blood book. The answer is a huge yes. Not only will there be differences between the books and the show like it was with Game of Thrones, but after reading Fire and Blood book you still don't know how most of the events really played out. Some would think that you could just read the book Fire and Blood to know what will happen in the show, based on that very same book. But that's far from truth. Why? Because Fire and Blood is not a non-conventional novel. It's an imaginary history book, and according to George R. R. Martin himself, not very accurate at that. Because while Fire and Blood book was written by George R. R. Martin, it wasn't written from him as facts, but rather through the perspective of the Citadel's Archmaester Gildain, who gathered all the info, and as many different sources as he could, and used it to write the book about the Targaryen history. Some info is fake, some info is true, some info is semi-true. No one will know for a fact what was happening in the real history, until the House of the Dragon airs in 2022. The show, unlike the book, will contain truth. It will depict what actually happened, not the changed history, fake or semi-true, not what might or might not have happened. Fire and Blood is a complete history of House Targaryen written by George R. R. Martin, from a perspective of Archmaester Gildain, who wrote it many decades after the events took place. Sure, most of the main events such as battles and deaths probably did happen, but as Gildain says it in the books, the full truth about what happened behind closed doors, in the privacy of stairwells, council rooms, and bedchambers he does not fully know, and he turns to many different sources, which usually differ from one another. He looks into the course of chronicles, laid down by Grand Maester Ransaiter and his successors, and many court documents as well. Gildain looks into accounts written decades later by the children and grandchildren of those caught up in the events of these times. While they are undoubtedly of use, so much time has passed between the event and the recording that many confusions and contradictions have inevitably crept in. Unfortunately, this is also true for Gildain's 2 accounts by first-hand observers that have come down to him. Septon Eustace, who served in the royal sept in the Red Keep during much of his time and spent much time as a confidant and confessor to King Viserys and his queens. His account is biased, favoring Aegon II over Rhaenyra. The second account is based upon the verbal account of the court full mushroom, who was present at court for all of them, for King Viserys, Princess and Queen Rhaenyra, and both King Aegon's, the second and the third. During his reign, King Baelor I Targaryen had Mushroom's book burned on account of its scandalous content. There are several main sources for historical information on the Dance of the Dragons, which are frequently at odds with each other. Gildan also uses source written by Grand Maester Orwyle, who had served King Aegon II Targaryen on his council and was arrested by the forces of Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen when she took the city. Orwyle wrote his account while locked away in the Black Cells. Uncertain about whether he would survive the war, he attempted to paint himself in the best light possible. Grand Maester Munken's The Dance of the Dragons, a true telling, was based on Orwyle's account. Using all these sources, which often differ from one another, Archmaester Gildan wrote his work, Fire and Blood, his work about the history of House Targaryen. This format brings up Marne's major thematic point about the uncertainty of memory, and history being written by winners. Neither side truly won the war, and the decades after the war, both sides wrote their own biased history books trying to put their actions in a better light. Histories written by the Greens depict Aegon II in good light, and Rhaenyra in a bad light. On the other hand, histories written by the Blacks do the opposite. We'll know exactly what happened in this time period when the show comes out, and that's why you cannot just read Fire and Blood book and think you would know what actually happened or what will happen on the show. Books are written by Archmaester decades and decades after the events happened, using many sources that in most cases are very different from each other, and most of them are biased as well. The Dance of the Dragons was the most devastating war in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. The war of succession between Aegon II and his half-sister Rhaenyra over their father Viserys I's throne. Both of them thought they belonged on the Iron Throne. When people started declaring for one of them or the other, their fight divided the kingdoms in two. Targaryens fought Targaryens, brothers fought brothers, dragons fought dragons. By the time it was over, thousands were dead. The conflict would prove to be incredibly destructive for not only House Targaryen, but large parts of Westeros as well. Additionally, it devastated the Targaryens' dragon population, ultimately leading to their extinction within a few decades. They never truly recovered. By the end of the reign of King Viserys I Targaryen, 20 dragons were alive. The majority of these died during the civil war called the Dance of the Dragons, which began in 129 AC and lasted until mid-131 AC. The show will not jump straight into the fight. It will start with a few episodes of the prelude to the Targaryen Civil War, with King Viserys I likely dying after a few episodes, which is just enough to introduce us with all the characters, and which side they support as the future heir, as well as to set up all the animosity at the court. King Viserys I Targaryen had 3 children by his first queen, Aemma Arryn, but only one Princess Rhaenyra survived to adulthood. Lacking a son to succeed him, Viserys began to train Rhaenyra to be his heir, named her his heir, and Rhaenyra soon acquired support of hundreds of lords and landed knights. The king remarried in 106 AC, this time to Alicent Hightower, and had 4 more children, Aegon, Helaena, Aemond and Daeron. In 111 AC, a great tourney was held at King's Landing, on the 5th anniversary of Viserys' marriage to Alicent. During the opening feast, Queen Alicent wore a green gown, while Princess Rhaenyra dressed in the red and black of House Targaryen. Note was taken, and soon all of Rhaenyra's supporters started wearing black clothing, while all of Alicent's followers started wearing green. Over the years, the popular names applied to both factions were inspired by the colors they wore. Rhaenyra's supporters were called the Blacks, and Aegon II followers were called the Greens. Viserys I strengthened Rhaenyra's place in the succession by marrying her in 114 AC to Sir Laenor Velaryon, who himself had Targaryen blood through his mother, Princess Rhaenys. Rhaenyra gave birth to 3 sons, Jacaerys Lucerys and Joffrey Velaryon, during her marriage, although there were rumors that the father of this princess was not Laenor, but Sir Harwin Strong. After Laenor was killed in Spicestown in 120 AC, Rhaenyra married her uncle, infamous rogue prince, Prince Daemon Targaryen, the younger brother to Viserys I. Her sons by him were Aegon the Younger, called so to distinguish him from his uncle, Alicent's Aegon, who was occasionally called Aegon the Elder, and Viserys. The relationship between Rhaenyra and Alicent declined early in Alicent's marriage to Viserys, since both ladies had been trying to be the realm's first lady, and there could only be one. Alicent's father, Sir Otto Hightower, had also disliked Rhaenyra's second husband, Prince Daemon, since the beginning of Viserys' reign. The war began when King Viserys I died. His designated heir for many years had been his only surviving child by his first wife, his daughter Rhaenyra. Since Viserys I later remarried, however, and had several younger children by his second wife Alicent Hightower, the eldest of which was Rhaenyra's half-brother Aegon II. The Seven Kingdoms had never had a ruling queen before, and many were troubled by the thought of Rhaenyra succeeding to the throne. By the inheritance law of the Andals, a younger brother succeeds ahead of an elder daughter, but the Targaryens had never formalized royal inheritance laws for their new realm, after the War of Conquest 130 years before. Viserys I, however, had extracted the oaths of fealty from the major lords of the realm, that Rhaenyra would succeed him. The same day that Viserys I died, Aegon II's followers, the Greens, staged a coup, and he was soon crowned in King's Landing. Rhaenyra, as the Princess of Dragonstone, had her power based on Dragonstone Island, where she responded by being crowned a queen, and declaring Aegon a traitor. Aegon II's main supporters were his mother, Alicent's family, the powerful House Hightower that rules Old Town, as well as the Lannisters. Rhaenyra's main supporters were her first husband's family, House Velaryon, as well as her mother's family, House Arryn, and her uncle and future husband, the most dangerous man in the Seven Kingdoms, and the most experienced commander, Daemon Targaryen. The Blacks were mostly in the northeastern half of Westeros, while the Greens were mostly in the southwestern half. Dorne was not yet part of the realm, and remained neutral during the war. The Blacks included the Aryans, the Starks, and the Tullys, along with most if not all of the River Lords, even the Freys. The Starks felt bound by honor to remain true to the filthy oaths they had made to Rhaenyra, and her father was still alive. Major Greens included the Hightowers and Lannisters. Rhaenyra had thought the Baratheons would give her support, but in what she saw as a major betrayal, they sided with Aegon II. The Greens faced their own betrayal, however. They had assumed that all of the Reach would side with the Greens, but instead the northern half of the Reach sided with the Blacks. Even some of the Hightowers' own direct vessels in the south sided with the Blacks. The Tyrells remained officially neutral throughout the war. The Greens had thought that the Greyjoys would join them, not realizing that the great wealth they controlled ironically made them a more enticing target. Seeing a small profit in sailing all the way to the eastern side of Westeros to raid the modest lands of the Vale or Dragonstone, the Greyjoys nominally sided with the Blacks in order to raid the Lannister Hightower lands along the eastern coast. Despite the Greens controlling the wealthier lands of Westeros, the Blacks had the advantage of control of the seas. The Greens only had the Redwyne fleet to rely on for naval power, while through House Velaryon, Rhaenyra's forces controlled most of the royal fleet. After the Greyjoys sided with the Blacks, however, the Iron Fleet tied up the Redwynes in their raids on the west coast, giving the Blacks free run of the eastern coast. The Greens attempted to counter this by allying with the Kingdom of the Three Daughters, an alliance of Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh, whose fleet assaulted Rhaenyra's fleets in the massive Battle of the Gullet. 1/3 of the Valyrian fleet was lost, but the 2/3 of the Three Daughters fleet was destroyed, and the survivors withdrew from the rest of the war. Overall, this meant that despite the Greens' numerical superiority, they had to slowly struggle to march their armies over land to attack the Blacks, instead of being able to quickly move their larger armies by sea. After Rhaenyra was crowned queen by Daemon at Dragonstone and declared her half-brother a traitor, King Aegon II declared Rhaenyra and Daemon traitors as well. After being persuaded by his mother Alicent and sister Helaena, Aegon dispatched Grand Maester Orwyle to Dragonstone with a retinue under a peace banner, offering Rhaenyra generous terms, but was refused. Rhaenyra's sons departed on their dragons to seek allies and make pacts on their mother's behalf. Her eldest son Jacaerys went visiting the Aryans of the Eyrie, the Manderleys of White Harbor, and the Starks of Winterfell. Rhaenyra's second son Lucerys traveled to Baratheons at Storm's End. Prince Daemon led the Blacks' attack on Harrenhal, which was conquered without bloodshed. The Castellan, Sir Simon Strong, yielded when he saw Daemon's dragon Xerxes. This conquest led to victories of the Blacks at the Burning Mill and Stone Hedge, and allowed the River Lords to gather at Harrenhal. In the meantime, Jacaerys gained Lady Arryn and the Lords Manderley, Borrell and Sunderland, and Cregan Stark to Rhaenyra's cause, with Lord Stark allying through the Pact of Ice and Fire. Lucerys flew to Storm's End, arriving before a gathering storm. He found Prince Aemond and his dragon Vhagar already present. Aemond tried to get Lucerys into a fight, insulting him, calling him a strong bastard, but Lucerys, who sworn to his mother not to fight, refused him. He delivered his message to Lord Boros Baratheon, but was refused and told to leave. Boros prevented Aemon from attacking his cousin in the castle, but did allow for the prince to follow him. Mounted on his dragon, Aemon caught up with Lucerys during a raging storm. The fight between the two dragons did not last long. Vhagar, being 5 times bigger, had the advantage, and Arx fell broken. His head and neck washed a short 3 days later, along with the corpse of Lucerys. Rhaenyra collapsed when learning of Lucerys' death. Prince Daemon at Harrenhal sent a raven to his wife, promising that her son's death would be avenged. Using one of his friends from King's Landing, Daemon enlisted the help of a former sergeant in the City Watch, known now as Blood, and a rat catcher from the Red Keep, now known only as Cheese. The two sneaked into the Red Keep, using secret tunnels and hidden doors, which brought them into the Tower of the Hand. There Queen Alicent was bound and gagged, and her bedmaid strangled. When Queen Helena and her 3 children appeared, Blood and Cheese barred the doors, and told Helena to choose which of her sons would die. Helena reluctantly chose Maelor, but Blood did the opposite, and killed Prince Jaehaerys instead. The two fled with the prince's head. The war was a stalemate, with many unexpected victories as well as unexpected losses for both sides, with no clear victor emerging. Even King's Landing itself was attacked, though there was no siege. Rhaenyra's new husband Daemon, her own uncle, had reorganized and essentially created the City Watch, as it would later be known, and they remained loyal to him. After the Greens foolishly left the capital city, lightly defended, to attack Rhaenyra's armies gathering at Harrenhal, her forces on Dragonstone moved against King's Landing, and the Gold Cloaks threw the gates open at their arrival. The war eventually degenerated into a near anarchy, as a string of betrayals happened in rapid succession on both sides. Rival kings started popping up in different parts of the realm, ranging from the Greyjoys behaving functionally independent, to dragon riders deciding that they would make better kings than Rhaenyra or Aegon II, to even petty street thugs carving out their own fiefdoms in King's Landing, and declaring themselves king of half the city. There's many interesting and legendary side characters as well. We have a combination of Varys and Littlefinger in Larry Strong, being the one in shadows, orchestrating many events and making kings rise and fall. We also have Melisandre is Alice Rivers, Aemon Targaryen's mistress, and perhaps that's even Melisandre herself in her younger days. Alice sees visions in the flames, and has some great powers. Rocalia Rindun, Pirate King, is another legendary side character in this story. If even half the stories about him are true, he's probably one of the most insane and most fascinating characters I've ever read. It's a Targaryen civil war, so of course Targaryens and their dragons play the main roles in the series. But the Starks, Lannisters, Aryans, Tullys and Hightowers are very important as well. One of the most exciting 1v1 fights is definitely legendary Daemon Targaryen against Aemon, the one eye that happened above the God's Eye, and resulted with both men and both their dragons dying. Although Daemon did win a fight by piercing his Valyrian steel sword through Aemon's eye socket, but seconds later both dragons hit a lake at rapid speed. Aemon's body was found, but Daemon's wasn't. Historians say Daemon died in this fight, but singers sing of his departure from Westeros to live out his days in Essos. I'm not going to talk about every single event, but all of these things I mentioned is what essentially kickstarted this Dance of the Dragons, referring to Viserys' death, animosity between the Greens and the Blacks. Especially the first fight, where Rhaenyra lost her son, did turn into a violent, long, bloody tale full of revenge, violence, lust, love, and dragon-to-dragon aerial battles. The civil war lasted 2 years, and gutted the Seven Kingdoms, with dragons burning out vast swaths of the countryside, and the entire towns reduced to ashes. The devastation was so great that it took a full generation to recover. At the start of the war there were 20 living dragons, 9 older and huge dragons, 8 younger dragons, still large enough to be ridden to war, and 3 hatchlings too small to ride. By the end of the war, all but 3 had died. Another dragon was hatched near the end of the war, bringing the total number of surviving dragons to 4. None of them would live for long, and there were too few dragons left to maintain a stable breeding population. The last dragon, said to be a stunted creature, died only 33 years after the war ended, later in the reign of Rhaenyra's son King Aegon III, for which he became known as Aegon the Dragonbane. 20 major battles, even more smaller battles, and even more betrayals, turncloaks and twists. All of that this Game of Thrones prequel show House of the Dragon brings in 2022. thank you so much for watching, hope you enjoyed this video and let me know what team are you on in the comment section down below. Team Black supporting Rhaenyra or Team Green supporting Aegon.